Hi everyone, I'm Elspeth from Ragged Life, and today I'm going to be doing a little bit of a tutorial on how to make a rag rug sunflower shopping bag. It's all made using old clothing, fabric offcuts, remnants you find around the house. If any of you have any kind of offcuts from quilting or patchworking or dressmaking, this is a great little project to use them up. And I'm going to be focusing on teaching you two different techniques of rag rugging, you lucky guys. So I'm going to get going. So I've got a few different tools in front of me. For anyone who does rag rugging, hopefully these are familiar, but I'm aware that quite a few of you are probably complete beginners to rag rugging. So I'm just going to introduce what I've got here before I get going. The first little tool that I've got here is a rag rug spring tool. So this is the easiest and quickest tool to do the traditional Shaggy technique of rag rugging that I'm just showing on my screen now. It gives you a really beautiful thick texture which looks absolutely great, and it's really easy, super forgiving technique, so anyone can use this tool. I'll also be showing you how to use a rag rug gauge, which is a really nifty little gadget. I'm not going to give the game away now because obviously you want to see it in action, but it's just a time and effort saving tool to help you cut your strips to the right length. This lovely little beautiful thing here is called a rug hook. And we're going to be doing the traditional loopy style of rag rigging with this particular tool. I'm just showing you a picture on the screen at the moment. And for anyone who feels like rag rigging's maybe a little bit too wild for their taste, the loopy technique is a really lovely technique for getting things that are quite pictorial, dare I say it, neat, and they look really good. So bear with me for that part of the tutorial. Super obvious, just a marker pen. We're going to be sketching a little bit of a design onto the hessian, so make sure you've got a marker pen at the ready. And a good pair of fabric scissors. Rag rigging involves a fair amount of cutting, and in fact we cut through lots of layers of fabric at the same time. So I actually use rag rug scissors because they cut through multiple layers, any kind of fabric you can imagine. They are the tank of the scissor world. So just make sure that your fabric scissors are up to scratch. So the fabric that we're going to be using today to make our sunflower is this little natty fabric here, which, would you believe it, is the offcuts from Brazilian dance costumes, because my mum does Brazilian dance and she has some outfits, and these are some offcuts from them. But they're a beautiful bright yellow, which is what we need for a sunflower. And then I've also got what I think is a synthetic fabric, that is a leopard print shirt. So we've got some offcuts and we've got some clothing, just to show that you can use both. If you were looking for fabrics at home, focus purely on colour because that's what makes the sunflower look best. So look for a really vibrant, bright yellow, and preferably a leopard print if you can find it. If not, you can actually blend together different browns, blacks, creams together to create the inside of our sunflower. So I'm going to start off by deconstructing this leopard print shirt that we've got in front of us, because it's not a lovely flat bit of fabric. It's a bit more complicated than that. So, oh, sorry, before I get going, what fabrics can you use to rag rug? So you can use anything pretty much, as long as it's not going to shed a lot of fibres when you cut into it. So you don't want to be working with really kind of loosely woven fabrics. So things like summer scarves that when you cut into them, they shed quite a lot. Or also at the opposite end of the spectrum, upholstery fabric, which is really annoying because you want to use it up. But when you cut into that, it just falls apart because it's woven from quite coarse fibres together. So anything that is soft, thin, and quite non-textured, so quite smooth, is good to work with. So t-shirt fabric, shirts, so cotton, swimming costumes, anything you can pretty much find around the house. So I'm going to deconstruct this shirt that's in front of me here. It feels a bit naughty doing this, but we're going to do it anyway. So the first step of the process is actually to turn your garment inside out so that you can see where all of the seams are on the garment. So you can just see that seam that's just there. Once you've turned your garment inside out, it's about, and you can even see the label in there, it's about deconstructing our garment. So we're actually going to reverse dressmake it and break it down into the blocks from which it was made. So I'm just going to cut along either the left or the right side of all of my major seams. And you can be a little bit wiggly with this. Rag rugging is a very imperfect craft. It's possibly the most forgiving craft that you'll ever come across. So if anyone needs a bit of a detox from things that are a bit more detailed, then rag rugging is the one for you. But all I'm doing is just breaking it down into the blocks from which it was made. So with a traditional t-shirt, you would cut on either the left or the right side of those major side seams, and then you'd cut around the arms of the t-shirt to separate them from the blocks of fabric as well. So my first block of fabric that I have separated out is actually the back block of my garment. And the only bits that I've got left are the little hems and seams around the outside. The only things that I tend to leave on at this stage are seams, pockets, and any darts and things like that. Don't feel like you have to deal with them straight away. I then need to deal with all of the seams that have been left on the garment, because you can actually make usable strips out of them. So the average width of strip that we use in rag rugging is roughly the width of the gauge, and it's about 2 centimeters in width. So I'm now going to cut my seams off, but I'm just going to cut, leaving a bit of extra fabric along the edge of the seam to make it roughly 2 centimeters wide. And once again, if it goes slightly narrower, if it goes slightly wider, it's not going to be the end of the world. So don't panic. I normally say go with your gut and you can't go wrong. So this would be my first strip of rag rigging. So I'm going to pop that over there. Then I am going to cut this little neckline off because that's a little bit thick. But once again, I could keep that and I could rag rug with that as well. It's nice being able to use up as much as you possibly can from one garment, because then we're creating less wastage, which is all in the ethos of rag rigging. So now I've got my block of fabric. It's not completely square, it's not rectangular, it's a bit wonky, but it's got no seams or anything left on. As I said, the only things you leave on are pockets and also darts. Then I'm going to fold my fabric in half, like so. Then I fold it in half the same direction again, then the same direction again, and you keep folding your bit of fabric until you have what looks like a little bit of a tube, like, oops, she says, like this. I'm then going to pop it down on the table, the tube, and actually because mine's a fairly silky fabric, it wants to open up, so I'm just going to weigh it down with my gauge so it doesn't do that. And then what you do is you cut through lots of layers of fabric at the same time to create the rest of your strips. So once again, the width that I'm cutting is roughly 2 centimeters in width. If you do have any questions specifically on how to do this, maybe worth looking at some of my YouTube videos, because I have got some specific videos which address a lot of the questions that may come up, and that would be at Ragged Life on YouTube. But all we're doing is just cutting along that tube of fabric, because when those bits open up, they're a little bit wonky, but they're pretty good and they're roughly the right width for rag rigging with. So generally when you're cutting these strips, the thicker your fabric is, the narrower you cut these strips. So if you were working with something like denim, for example, that's really thick and a bit hard to work with, you would cut your strips only about 1 centimetre wide. But most of the time, about 2 centimetres is about right. If you're working with a really thin fabric, like I am, I could even cut them a bit wider, but I'm just going to go the average width for the moment because it's just making it a bit easier. So just keep cutting like so. And I think I've got plenty of strips here, so I'll just leave them for the time being. Oh, she says, may as well finish the tube now. Okay, and that one's a bit wonky, but it's going to go in there anyway. So these strips are perfect for doing that central part of our sunflower here. And what we would do is if we were deconstructing that whole garment, we'd repeat that process of what I've done with those first strips on every single block of the fabric. So we would do that with the front of the t-shirt or shirt, we'd do it with the back, we'd do it with the sleeve, we'd do it with each block that we've deconstructed from the original garment. And we'd have a lovely big mountain of rags here to work with. But fortunately, we're not having to do loads of rag rigging today, so this should hopefully do me. And we're going to move on to the yellow. So fortunately for me, because this is the offcuts from another sewing project, it hasn't got any hems or seams or anything on it. So it's a lovely big block of fabric. So I'm going to repeat the process so you get another little look at how it works. This is actually a triangle. So you find the longest length of the bit of fabric and you always fold it in half along that edge. Even though it won't end up perfectly kind of aligned, it just means that you get the longest strips possible. So once again, doing exactly the same process, creating my lovely tube of fabric. In terms of how many times you fold your fabric, it really depends on how good your scissors are. Because if you've got really good scissors, you can cut through loads of layers at the same time, so you can keep folding and folding. Also, if you're working with a fairly thin fabric, it's best to just keep folding it as much as you can. So once again, cutting my strips by cutting through lots of layers. Don't worry if they're not perfect, but once again, roughly the width of that gauge. And there's something quite therapeutic about doing the fabric prep process of rag rigging, because it's just quite repetitive. You can do it in front of the TV. As we said, it's not very accurate. By the way, you can do this cutting with a rotary cutter if you want to, but what I find is when you're working with uneven blocks of fabric, things that aren't perfectly straight, it doesn't really speed you up all that much to use a rotary cutter, because generally you can't cut through as many layers without it partially cutting through one layer and just making it a little bit kind of, I don't know, harder to work with. So some of these bits at the end where my fabric wasn't quite square or rectangular are going to be really short and a little bit odd looking. But you just put them in with the other ones anyway, because some of it will be usable, like so. So now we've got a lovely kind of pile, similar to our leopard print, of yellow strips. So we can't leave these yellow strips lovely and long, because for this particular one, we're going to be doing the shaggy technique of rag rigging, which is made up of individual strips of fabric rather than one continuous strip. So to make those petals, we are going to use the gauge to cut them to length. So we're going to grab normally about 6 of our strips together in a pile. I actually think I was sticking out my tongue then for concentration, so do whatever you feel works for you. And you can see that mine are definitely not perfect, my strips. They can twist and turn as much as you want. I've got some that are longer than others, and you keep going, getting them vaguely aligned, like so. With this particular technique, the Shaggy one, if your fabric has a right side and a wrong side, some of both sides will always show. So you're best off choosing a fabric that doesn't have a right side and a wrong side if you can. But sometimes it doesn't really matter because you're best off just using what you've got lying around and properly recycling. So I'm holding my strips so that they're at one end of the gauge, so that the tops of them are vaguely aligned with that groove at the very top of the gauge, because we're going to chop these long strips into lovely short strips. So my first wrap around the gauge is to trap the ends so that they don't fall off the gauge. Then I'm just continually wrapping the strips. I try and keep them facing the same direction if I can, but to be honest, it doesn't matter too much. If you've got shorter strips, you try and trap them underneath the longer strips so that they don't fall off the gauge, like so. And then once you've got it all nicely captured in, and you can see that it's quite an even thickness across the gauge. It's not bulky at one end and thin at the other. Ooh, one bit wants to come free. So then we cut down the groove at the top. So hopefully you can see that okay. And what I'm left with is a lovely pile of similar length strips for shaggy rag rigging, like so. So if I was doing something like a rug, just a traditional rag rug, those would be a lovely shape and that would look lovely. But because we're doing our sunflower and we want the ends to look a little bit more petally, we need to do a little bit of shaping so that the ends aren't flat, so that they're a bit more pointy. So what I tend to do at this stage is just align a group of these strips together into a lovely pile. And as I said, it doesn't have to be perfect. Nothing about this craft does have to be perfect. We're going to just pop them on top of each other, like so. And I've probably got about 10 strips here in a pile. You vaguely make them so that they align. And then what I'm going to do is just cut them as a group into a petal shape. So you're just trying to point the ends slightly. And they don't have to be perfect, but can you see here? That's just a slightly rounded end to it. I'm going to pop them over there. And then we're going to do exactly the same with the other end. So what we're looking for is something that looks slightly like a bit of a petal. And where they're slightly misaligned, they're never going to be completely perfect, but they'll look something like this in the end. And those are perfect petals to be working with. So for the moment, I'm just going to get on with the rag rigging and the technique so that you don't have to watch me doing a whole load of cutting at the same time. So this is where our blank shopping bag comes into play. So you could, if you wanted to, if you had a bit of hessian lying around, make your own bag. I know some of you guys are, wicked talented sewists, in which case maybe give yourself another challenge. But if you want to just buy a pre-made bag, we've got them on the Ragged Life site. What you need to make sure is that they're unlaminated on the inside. So sometimes these hessian shopping bags have plastic coating on the inside, in which case they're very difficult to then rag rug through. So just make sure you're buying the right type. I'm now going to plonk this shopping bag onto my work surface. And I'm going to mark out where my sunflower is going to be. So this is kind of like a little alternative sunflower that I've previously done. So you can see what happens if you leave your yellow pieces so that they're flat on the end. But I'm looking for a sunflower that's going to be in the centre of my shopping bag, and it's going to be quite a nice, decent size. So actually, this is why I've brought this bowl here, because I'm going to position that bowl quite centrally into my shopping bag, so it's near the centre. And with my marker pen, I'm going to draw around it. If you're someone who is quite perfectionist and you want to make sure that it's absolutely dead centre, get a ruler or a tape measure and just make sure you find your central spot on the hessian. But to be honest, rag rigging's a little bit kind of wild and falls where it wants to fall anyway. So if you are slightly off centre, it's not going to show anyway. So I normally just eyeball it and just go for it. So I'm now going to sketch around my bowl onto the hessian. So I'm just sketching around. Don't worry about getting the marker pen on the bowl because it normally wipes off absolutely fine. And the big reveal, pop those back in the bowl. I have now got a circle sketched onto my shopping bag, and that's going to be where I'm going to be rag rigging. So the first part of the sunflower is obviously to make those lovely yellow petals around the outside. And because we've got our circle sketched out, it's quite nice because we can just follow the line that we've drawn. And we're going to be using the spring tool for this particular technique. So just make sure when you're working with the spring tool that you don't accidentally rag rug through both the front layer and the back layer of your shopping bag. Trust me, even experts do it. I've done it occasionally. So just lift the top part away from the bottom part when you're first working with it. So it's quite important at the beginning that you keep the spring tool closed. So this is what the spring tool looks like when it's closed. And then this is what it looks like when it's open. So closed, open. So with the spring tool closed, you want to poke the very tip of the spring tool into the hessian so that it's only just through and you're on that line that you've drawn. You then weave up and kind of across the hessian so that you can capture normally 2 or 3 strands onto the barrel here. So then you open up the spring tool, you grab one of those lovely petals that you've created, and you can see mine isn't by any means perfect, but it's good enough, and you grab onto the point of the petal. And then with it closed, you just pull through, so you get one end on one side and one end on the other. That is your first piece of Shaggy rag rigging. So only a few, dozen more and you'll be done. So for my first 3 pieces that I put into the hessian, I always like to do them really nice and close to help tighten the hessian up, because I've only got one bit of the rag rigging in there. If someone yanked it, it would just come out. The only thing that secures your rag rigging from falling out of the hessian is the hessian tightening around your rag rigging as you put more fabric in and almost locking things in place. So with my next bit of rag rigging, I'm going to go into the same hole that I just came out of, and I'm just going to weave across the top of the hessian again. So I've gone into the same hole I came out of, and then I've come a couple away. And you can go either clockwise or anti-clockwise, it doesn't matter which direction. Once again, grabbing onto the point of the petal and just pulling half through. And as you begin to put more pieces in, your petals will begin to stand up a little bit. So once again, with my 3rd piece, going into the same hole I came out of, weaving across the top to capture a couple of strands, grabbing onto the end of the strip and just pulling through. And it will start to, from the back of the hessian, look like this. So you can see that it's all lovely and flat on the back. There shouldn't be any bits coming through on the underneath. And I've made sure not to capture the back part of my shopping bag as I'm going. So once you've got your first 3 in and it's lovely and tight and they're beginning to stand up, I then generally start to miss out 2 strands of the hessian between one piece and the next. So bear in mind that hessian comes in different weaves. So if you were using a looser weave than this, you'll have to rag rug closer together. And if you're using a tighter weave, you'll probably have to go a bit further apart. But this is the weave of hessian that we sell on our Ragged Life website, and it's 10 holes per inch, which I think is the best. So then, missing out 2 strands in the hessian, weaving across as we've done before, opening up the end, grabbing onto the end of the petal and just pulling through. And you just repeat. So you keep missing out 2 strands at a time, and you don't have to go straight across the hessian. You can go diagonal, you can go up, down, left, right, whichever direction you want. But I like to go in the direction of travel. So I like to go along that line and just keep going. Don't agonize about exactly how far you're going away. It's, you know, if you miss out 2 strands, 3 strands, 1 strand, it's not going to be the end of the world. What you just want is for there to be enough fabric in that hessian so that the hessian begins to tighten around your pieces. So I've now ran out of my lovely prepped petals, but you can see how it's already starting to shape up quite nicely. Hopefully it's bringing a nice sunny smile to your face. And now I'm going to enter slightly speedier mode so that you can see how it is developing as I create more petals. So I'm going to start prepping some more. And that's the first row done. Onto the second row. So for this part, I'm going to go a couple of strands inside of my first circle. You don't have to be too perfect where you go, just try and keep it relatively close to your first circle and try and follow it in a nice second circle if you can. And voila! So this is what the outside of the circle looks like when it's fully done. You can see it looks quite nice and quite jolly. As you put in more of the rag rugging, it started to all stand up quite nicely, which is what creates this effect. I'm just going to show you what the inside looks like, just so you can make sure that it's looking okay on your one. So can you see here that my pieces are quite close together, so the hessian has somewhat tightened around my rag rugging, but I'm not going into every single hole. If you go a bit too close together in rag rugging, it can make your hessian pucker up and curl a bit. So just try and loosen it out a bit, don't go into every hole, and try and keep your spacing fairly consistent if you can. So now we need to fill in the center of our sunflower. So you can improvise as much as you want. So with this particular sunflower, I've blended together different shades of brown, black, grey, cream, because I didn't have any leopard print fabric. So this is perfectly okay as well, but I am going to be using the strips that we cut earlier to do the loopy technique of rag rigging. So just as a bit of a refresher, this is what the loopy technique looks like. So it creates a really flat, nice, uniform effect. So we're going to get started now. So with this particular technique, it's slightly trickier than the Shaggy one. because we're working from both the front of the hessian and the underside of the hessian. So I'm going to do a little bit of rag rigging and then I'm going to show you a little bit closer how it's done. But first of all, you need to get your rug hook wherever it's ended up. And these come in different sizes, so just be careful that you get a fairly medium size one. We've got some on the Ragged Life website if you need to have a look. But I've got my strip of fabric, which is a nice long strip, underneath the hessian. And I'm going to start a couple of strands inside of my last row. And it doesn't matter which direction you go. So some people prefer going clockwise, some people go anti-clockwise, some people even fill in the center in rows. Do what feels good to you. But I'm going to kind of come towards myself with the rag rigging. So the first step is that you poke your hook into a hole, a couple of strands inside of your last row. Then underneath the hessian, you can't really see what I'm doing, but I'm just grabbing onto the top of the strip and pulling it through to the top of the hessian. And normally I pull that strip so that it's whatever height I want my loops to be at. But because you guys are beginners, leave it a little bit longer. So I would probably leave it a couple of centimeters, and then you can always cut it shorter later. Give it a nice little haircut. So I'm now going to miss out 2 strands in the hessian from where my end came out. And I'm going to go through to the underside of the hessian, and I'm just placing the strip into the hook and just pulling a little loop to the top. And you can pull those loops to whatever height you want. So you can have them either really high or really short. I like to have them kind of the height of a pinky finger, so about a centimetre or so. And that creates a nice contrast with the slightly longer shaggy rag rigging. Then you repeat. So you miss out 2 strands in the hessian, place the strip onto the hook, and just pull a lovely little loop to the top. And it's really good if you can try and keep your loops fairly consistent in height. You can, if you can't find a rug hook, you can actually do this particular technique with a latch hook as well. I've got another video on YouTube where it shows how you can loopy rag rug with a latch hook. So just look for Ragged Life if you want to find that. But all I'm doing is just putting the hook down into a hole in the hessian, grabbing onto my strip underneath and pulling a little loop to the top. And you can see how it's developing quite nicely already. What I find is it's better to pull the loop a little bit too high and then pull it shorter with the strip underneath the hessian than it is to pull it too short and then have to pick at it with your fingers. So just continually going along. With this particular technique, you keep going until you reach the end of your strip. So the longer your strips are, the better really, because you can get into a bit of a rhythm. And you can already see that because my leopard print fabric is patterned, it's creating this lovely kind of like sunflower pattern within the outer ring. I'm now at the point where my end of strip needs to come to the top. So I'm just going to show you on the underside what the rag rigging looks like. So you can see, oops, sorry, it's not very glamorous with me folding this bag inside out, but can you see how lovely and flat my rag rigging is on the back? If you have any big lumps and bumps on the back of the rag rigging, it's because you haven't pulled the excess through to the top. So just concentrate on pulling those loops a little bit further up when you pull through with the hook from the top. But you can see that I've got this little end through to the top. If that got caught, it would pull the whole strip of rag rigging out. Ooh. So try not to do that. What we're going to do is pull it to the top instead. So where my last loop was, I go into the very next hole, so only missing a strand, and I'm just pulling that end through. And I'm now going to chop my first end and my last end. to exactly the same height as all my loops are at. I should have said earlier, all of the little scraps that I cut off, I like to keep them for things like stuffing, because I like to create as little waste as possible. So if you do want to repurpose the bits where you've shaped the shaggy pieces, keep them. I'm sure you can use them for something. So that's my first row of loopy rag rigging. And all I need to do now, she says, is just continue going on from the outside to the center, and I'm going to spiral my way into the center of the flower. Right, so I've just done my last loop there, so I'm just going to pull my final end through to the top. Sometimes it can be a little bit tricky to see where you're going when you're right in the middle, but I have found it. So I've pulled that end through to the top, and we're just going to do a final trim of all of those little bits. So all of your single ends through to the top should all be nice and short so that they're hidden amongst your loops. So let's just cut that big bit off. And those little bits, my last bit, clear those little strands off. So this is what my final sunflower bag looks like. If it's a little bit sheddy like this, you can just give it a quick little vacuum and it will just take the very top layers off. But yeah, that's a rag rug shopping bag using the traditional shaggy technique using the spring tool and using the loopy technique using a rug hook. And I've been Elspeth Jackson. I hope that you've enjoyed our little intro to rag rugging. If you'd like to follow me, you can find me on Instagram as @raggedlife. Thanks everyone.